The Blaustein School houses Rutgers programs of planning, public policy, and public health. And our faculty members research social policy issues spanning from family self-sufficiency to public health interventions onto environmental impacts on health. And since my arrival here, we've begun to examine education policy issues like pre-K expansion, early childhood educators' professional development, and children's school readiness, and also the longitudinal impacts of early education programs. This lecture is the 9th education policy lecture Blaustein has hosted over the last 3 years. And we've been able to do this through our partnerships with the Education Law Center, the Foundation for Child Development, and now the GSE. I'm especially happy to collaborate with the GSE on this lecture because we're interested in building stronger ties between the two schools. And my colleague, Drew Jatomer, approached me with the opportunity for collaborating on this lecture, and I'm so glad to be a part of it. Drew joined the GSE faculty as the Rose and Nicholas DeMarzo Chair in Education back in 2011. He's a member of the Learning and Teaching Department, and his overall research agenda examines the assessment and evaluation of teaching and related policy issues to teacher education. His body of work consists of examining constructs related to teaching quality, including classroom quality interactions, and teacher knowledge and beliefs and student achievement. Prior to coming to Rutgers, Jatomer was a researcher and senior vice president of researcher at ETS in Princeton, New Jersey. There he led the Understanding Teaching Quality Center. And while at ETS, he conducted research on assessments for students, all from the perspective of developing assessment methods that are directly related to instruction and learning. And Drew is currently co-editing the AERA Handbook of Research on Teaching, and he's the co-editor of Education Evaluation and Policy Analysis. Please join me in welcoming Drew to the platform.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. Good afternoon. It is my pleasure to welcome you all here for the inaugural Rose and Nicholas DeMarzo lecture. And it's so nice to see so many friends and colleagues who've come to today's talk, so thank you. I have the pleasure of being the first holder of the DeMarzo Chair, and it was established by Charles DeMarzo in honor of his parents to support scholarship in teaching and teaching quality. Before introducing our speaker, I'd like to thank Stephanie Kieranton and the Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy for providing this wonderful venue for the lecture and being such gracious hosts, so thank you. I also want to thank my associate Colleen McDermott. Where did Colleen go? There she is. We'll put this entire event together, not once, but twice, thanks to Sandy. It's been a little smoother sailing this time around, although we weren't sure the food was going to come, but it just came. We had the liquor, so we were okay. Today's talk. I am so thrilled to introduce our speaker, Pam Grossman. Pam is the Nomalini Olivier Professor in the Graduate School of Education at Stanford University, where she also received her PhD. She spent much of her academic career at the University of Washington and was also a high school teacher, primarily in English. Anybody who studies teaching and teacher education knows how important Pam's work has been and how important her voice has been to the field. She's been at the forefront of research on the intersection of subject matter knowledge and practice in teaching and teacher education. She has written important papers considering how institutional policies and practices in school districts, as well as teacher education programs, can support and interfere with good teaching practice. More recently, she's been conducting seminal work on pathways by which people enter teaching, addressing issues such as characteristics of program preparation, labor market forces, and educational policy. And of course, she has been centrally involved in issues of measuring teaching quality, particularly in the context of English language arts, work that she will discuss today. Pam has been involved in so many of the critical issues surrounding teaching over the past few decades. And in every area she has touched, she has added insight, perspective, and creative research that has moved and challenged the field in fundamental ways. For all of this, she has been appropriately recognized. She's a member of the National Academy of Education, the Vice Chair of the Spencer Foundation Board of Directors and has been honored by the AERA, Association of Teacher Educators, and American Association of Colleges of Teacher Education for her outstanding research contributions. As if all of this were not enough, Pam is a role model for all who have the good fortune to work with her, including me. She is always grounded, thoughtful, caring, and shares her wisdom and common sense in equal parts. So it is my pleasure to present Pam Grossman.
Thank you, Drew, for such a lovely introduction, and also for the honor of being the first lecturer in this series. It's wonderful to have a series and a chair that's devoted to teaching, because there's really nothing, the quality of teaching is the thing that I most care about in my research and the thing that I've spent the most time thinking about. I also want to thank Colleen for all of her help in organizing this trip, and as Drew said, not once, but twice, not only organizing, reorganizing, unorganizing, all of that effort. And also want to thank the faculty in the Rutgers Graduate School of Education for all the conversations today. So today I'm going to be talking about my most recent work, which takes off from the development of an observation protocol for observing secondary English classrooms and thinks about the use of these kinds of observation protocols, not just for measurement, but for improvement. Because as I mentioned, really what I care about is helping teachers get better to support student learning. So my focus is going to be really on the issue of improvement. I'll be talking about sort of three central ideas. The first is the notion of identifying core practices for the improvement of teaching. And I'll be drawing on some prior work that I did around the preparation of other professionals, the preparation of teachers, clergy members, and clinical psychologists for a framework for thinking about how we teach those core practices in professional education. So I'll be talking about using that framework and leveraging these observation protocols, and then designing innovative professional development around core practices identified in those protocols. So before I launch into that, I want to show you a text I would like to read in the New York Times, preferably the front page of the New York Times. There has never been a better time in America to be entering the world of education, a time when teachers have earned prestige unimaginable by their forebears, when excellent materials are increasingly available and educational issues, both serious and light, are front page news. I tell new students to learn the fundamentals of teaching, and the rest will follow. And more, that the degree of excellence with which they master those fundamentals will very likely determine their success for the rest of their teaching careers. This is an actual text, but I've changed the profession. It actually comes from a book called The Making of a Chef. And you've got to wonder why we can make those claims about chefs, which I actually think are accurate claims when you look at the news and you look at TV and you look at the rise of culinary institutes, and we can't yet make the same claim about teaching. The point that I want to pick up, though, from the text is the issue around mastering the fundamentals. Because the way I think about core practice are really the fundamental building blocks of teaching. And I actually agree with Michael Ruhlman that focusing and mastering the fundamentals will have a huge impact on teachers' ability to continue to grow and improve. So we're going to have a couple of culinary examples here because I like to cook, but also because I think it provides a useful touchstone. So one of my favorite shows is Chopped. Anybody watch Chopped? Oh, yeah. Okay. So in Chopped, for those of you who haven't had the good fortune to watch this, chefs are given a basket of very odd ingredients. Okay, it sometimes includes canned gummy worms and all kinds of innards of various types. And they're asked in 15 to 20 minutes to make an appetizer with these very disparate ingredients. And what shows through in the execution of that is their technique, right? What really matters ultimately is how well they know how to cook, no matter what shows up in their basket. So here I'm borrowing from Julia Child for another example of what some of those fundamentals are in cooking. This is from the Introduction to Mastering the Art of French Cooking. Cooking techniques include such fundamentals as how to saw a piece of meat so that it browns without losing its juices, how to fold beaten egg whites into a cake batter, how to add egg yolks to a hot sauce so they will not curdle, where to put the tart in the oven so it will brown and puff, and how to chop an onion quickly. Although you will perform with different ingredients for different dishes, the same general processes are repeated over and over again. Okay? So, my search in teaching has been for what are those core processes? What are the things that are going to occur so often that you want to make sure that novices who enter the field have a good foundation in those? Certainly other professions have begun to identify these kinds of fundamentals. So here's an example from medical school. One of the things doctors need to learn how to do is to perform a chest examination. Nobody assumes they will pick that up on their own with a little experience. Nobody assumes saying, go and watch somebody give a chest examination is sufficient for learning how to do this. And in part, what they've done here, as you can see, is to actually break apart the practice of learning to conduct a chest examination into fairly discrete pieces. From observing the respiratory effects and noting the presence or absence of respiratory distress, down through percussing the chest. So they've actually broken this down. So my interest is in beginning to identify the same kind of fundamental processes, practices of teaching. So what I want you to do for just about a minute or two is to turn the person next to you and see if you can identify one or two fundamentals of teaching, things that you think any novice who enters the classroom should be able to perform at a reasonable degree of proficiency. Stephanie, what did you say?
I said being able to build a lesson plan, like an instruction, that's
planning.
related to
Okay.
Common Core. Like now, the Common Core is a big thing. So
Okay.
I ask you a question that gets kids understanding.
good, we're on the same page because that is.
What you came up with?
We came up with engaging learners initially and accessing their prior knowledge.
Very important. Okay. Okay, so let's have a few examples. What did people identify?
Questioning skills.
Questioning skills, very fundamental. Yes?
Being able to assess and using that data to inform instruction.
Okay, knowing how, those two things. Knowing how to assess, that would be the first thing. Knowing how to use the assessments. Okay? Other, yes?
Classroom management skills.
Okay, what's an example of a classroom management skills?
Being able to keep students on task.
Okay, keeping students on task. So these are all things that we know that you're going to see teachers doing in classrooms and that they're going to be repeated over and over again. Okay? So again, the definition of core practices are those that are central to the daily work of teaching. They're also central to supporting student learning, right? That's part of what makes them fundamental. You're not beating egg whites for the sake of beating egg whites. You're beating egg whites in order to make a souffle. Similarly here, these are all practices that support student learning. And as I said, they're also fundamental to developing other more complex forms of practice. This is the way in which they're the building blocks of practice. So once you know how some basic assessments, you can use those principles to design more sophisticated forms of assessment. But it depends on understanding those basics first. Some of the key ideas related to this are, one, practices are learnable. So one of the things we always confront in teaching is the belief that teachers are somehow born and not made, that you're either a natural teacher or there's not much we can do for you. I think the idea of focusing on these practices helps us remember that teaching is a form of complex human performance that, like other complex human performances, can be learned. People can get better. Nobody assumes that the way people begin as a doctor, their first chest examination, is going to be a measure of how well they'll do it after a few years of experience. These are things people learn to do. Another fundamental thing about these core practices is that they may cut across different curricula or approaches to teaching. This is maybe more contentious. But again, whether you are teaching from open court or teaching Readers' Writers' Workshop, you have to know how to model writing processes for students. Modeling underlies both of those quite different curricular approaches. So again, if we're going to target something for teacher learning, let's target the things that are going to be useful across a range of curricula or circumstances. Again, the notion that teachers continue to develop their craft over time, that there are more and less sophisticated versions of these practices, and that you continue to develop them. The last part is thinking about how people get better. How, in fact, do you improve human performance? And I'm going to argue, based on some research, both my own research in other professions, as well as work on expertise, that people get better only when they have, one, opportunities to see representations of that practice, that they get to try out those practices on multiple occasions, right? You don't learn to do surgery by watching surgery. At some point, you've got to make that first cut. And finally, you need to get feedback on the practice. The only way you're going to continue to get better is if you get really quite specific feedback. Okay, so I had you generate some core practices on your own, and now we're going to use an actual artifact of a ninth grade English teacher to begin to identify what some of these core practices for the teaching of English might be. This is a New York City teacher who is teaching a unit on literature circles. So literature circles are where small groups of kids are all reading a common book, and they're prepared to have discussions about that book in small groups. So they've been doing this for a little while, and Emily is teaching a mini lesson. So this is a very short lesson that occurs before the kids go back into their small groups. Okay? In doing this, she's going to use a short text by Pat Conroy as a practice opportunity. Okay, so I think you know enough. I have to remember to unmute. Okay. As you're watching this, think about how you would describe what the teacher's doing.
But I want to add a discussion skill to it. Okay. So what I've observed in your discussion so far is that you are able to write really good discussion questions. We've practiced that since the beginning of the school year. What makes a good discussion question? We've charted that up. We've talked about open-ended questions. We've talked about underneath the surface. Okay? You guys are asking really good questions. But when I sit in on your conversations and listen to what is talked about, here's how it kind of goes. Like, for example, if I sat in on this conversation, not necessarily that this is exactly how it goes in your group, but just in general. Denora asks a really great question. Egypt gives her answer. It's really interesting. Andy gives his answer. It's really interesting. Gerald answers. And then the conversation dies. It doesn't go anywhere from there. And then someone's like, does anyone else have a question? Okay, Egypt has a question. So she asks her great question. We get a couple of good answers, and then the conversation dies. Right? It's how it works, right? That's how it works. Okay. So what I want to teach you today, or just remind you of today, so you probably already know how to do it, is just how to ask really good follow-up questions. Okay? So on your piece of paper, draw a little T-chart and write on the left-hand column starter questions and on the right-hand column write follow-up questions. We're just going to practice this because I feel like we haven't been doing enough of it in our discussions. So starter questions on the left and follow-up questions on the right.
So she's read them the story now.
Okay, so for example, and copy this down, and this is just my example. My starter question was, why did the author choose to focus on this particular moment? That's the question I would ask in my discussion group. Why did the author choose to focus on this particular moment? So let me ask one of you. Okay, I'm gonna create my follow-up questions based on what my group members say. So, Esther, why do you think he chose to focus on this particular moment?
It was a very emotional moment.
Okay, perfect answer. It was probably a really emotional moment for him. Okay? So now I am going to create a couple of follow-up questions to ask Esther. Okay? So now I want you to write these in the right-hand column. Okay? So a follow-up, it was a really emotional moment. Do you think it's particularly emotional because he was so young? Right? So you might write a follow-up question, how do I short that? Is it because it was during his childhood? What's that? Oh, okay. Well, that's right. Is it because he was only a child? Another follow-up question I might ask is, do you think that the father was drunk? Drunk.
Maybe.
Another follow-up question might be, do you think that the author was ever beaten by his father? So those two are yes or no questions, but I would just say, I would add explain, right? Like if Pedro answered maybe, then me as the questioner, I would just say, well, explain what you mean, okay? A third follow-up question might be,
Okay. So what, oh, turn off. How would you describe the teaching in the video? What are some of the things that you see the teacher doing? Yes?
She mentioned some practices that the students had developed in the past were strong, that she's now going to build on.
Okay, so she's,
from a place where, recognizing student strengths before building on that.
okay, great. So she's talking first about what they're already doing well, that she's going to build on that.
She's giving lots of verbal directions.
Okay, she's giving verbal directions.
She's modeling what she wants them to be able to do.
Okay, so she's modeling the asking of follow-up questions and writing them down, which is exactly the practice she wants them to do. Yes?
She's explicit and she's scaffolding, and it's a small piece so they can do it.
Okay. She's explicit about
What she wants to teach.
what she wants to teach. She ties it back to what they're already doing well and the next step, and she's providing some support, the scaffolding. Okay. Yeah, one more?
She's encouraging the students to use a graphic organizer.
She is using students to use a graphic organizer. And as many people have pointed out to me, she might also want to draw it, that people see it as well. So this is not perfect practice, but this is a way of describing what the teacher's doing.
I think she makes an important link with the students also. She asks them, do you agree with that? That is a weakness of yours.
Right.
And she gets them to agree.
Right, she gets the student ownership in that, and they all recognize the portrait she's painting, okay? So she's making that connection, okay? So she's connecting both to what their prior experience was and what they know about their own practice. So we could, when we observe teaching, describe qualitatively the kinds of things that we're seeing and There's actually a lot of agreement. I mean, the way you've described this clip is the way many people have described the clip. You've sort of seen some of the critical attributes of this clip. The value of observation protocols is that they begin to do the work of naming and defining some of these practices and coordinating both our vision around them and our talk. So they provide a common technical vocabulary. So modeling might be a good example of something that has lots of different meanings. So we might want to define, what do we mean by modeling? How do we define it? What are its attributes? Observation protocols also begin to do some of that work of decomposition that we saw in learning how to conduct a chest exam, right? It begins to break it down into smaller pieces and tell us not only the big practice, but what some of those subcomponents might be. And because we have a common vocabulary and a common way of describing teaching, we can begin to compare across different classrooms. So when I set out to do some work to look at the kinds of teaching in English that distinguish teachers who were most effective at achieving student gains, one of the things that I realized is while there are a lot of observation protocols out there, there were actually not very many observation protocols in literacy, and there were actually no protocols in secondary English language arts. So we have some that are around the teaching of elementary reading. We had some that focused on guided reading that were very specific to a curriculum, but nothing that was actually had been developed to look across the curricular areas of English language arts. So I didn't set out, I didn't write a grant to develop an observation protocol. I fell into it because I didn't mind the gap when we wrote the proposal. I sort of assumed these things were out there. So be careful of your assumptions. This started then a long effort to try to create an observation protocol that was specific to secondary English language arts. And my middle school daughter at the time named this the Protocol for Language Arts Teaching Observation, or Plato, around the dinner table one night when we said, we need a name, what can we call it? So this protocol built on prior research in English language arts, looking at what we had found through research on effective teaching. Again, part of what I wanted to do is be able to capture qualities of instruction that cut across different curricula, in part because we were observing in New York City the year that every school got to decide its own curriculum for English language arts. So we would have been in big trouble if we had developed a protocol for a single curriculum. One of the challenges of English is that it is so broad. It includes reading, writing, speaking, listening, drama, media literacy. Almost anything you can think of fits into English. So part of what we were also trying to develop was an observation protocol that could cut across content domains, that identified the practices that were most important, not just in the teaching of writing, but in the teaching of reading as well. So we ended up building an instrument that has 4 underlying constructs. You've already begun to identify some of the constructs as well as some of the elements. So the first has to do with instructional scaffolding, which is when I teach my own pre-service teacher education students, this is the principle that I focus on most heavily. That includes elements of providing explicit strategy instruction, which you saw her doing, right? Strategy of asking follow-up questions, modeling processes, or using models. In English, we often use a lot of models of particular text to illustrate its features or characteristics, providing that kind of targeted feedback that helps people get better, and making instructional accommodations for language learners. So all of those fit into that factor. The next is the representation and use of content. So you actually saw her providing verbal directions, but also instructional explanation about what follow-up questions were. So using those accurate and rich examples and explanations. Making productive connections to prior knowledge. So here she makes a productive connection saying this is what you already know how to do and this is what we're going to do next. as well as making instructionally relevant connections to students' personal or cultural backgrounds. So how do you use that knowledge in the understanding of literature and in helping people to become better writers? The third is the cognitive and disciplinary demand of tasks and talk. So we're interested, again, to the extent to which teachers set and then maintain purpose. So you saw her very, very clearly set purpose in that. This is what we're doing and why we're doing it. Creating and maintaining, again, the intellectual challenge of the classroom talk and activities. Again, we know from the TIMSS data that teachers are sometimes good at setting out a challenging task, but the demand degrades over time. So this element looks both at the initial cognitive demand and then how it's maintained or not over the lesson. Creating and facilitating high-quality opportunities for classroom discourse. This is just central to the teaching of English, where discussion is the vehicle for a lot of understanding and interpretive work. And finally, and this is from Plato 5.0, we had an element called text-based instruction, which involves both ensuring that students use and reference authentic texts, so the extent to which, again, they're going back to the text to support their interpretations and ideas, as well as producing authentic texts of their own. Part of what we want in the LA classrooms is for students not only to be reading, but to write as well. The fourth one is a much more general one on time and behavior management. So here's an example, and by now many of you are familiar with many different protocols, and they have a similar kind of underlying structure. What again I want to use is the language of core practices to think about what they represent. So the practice is really facilitating classroom discourse. That's the overall practice. One of the challenges in developing observation protocols, particularly for evaluation, is that you don't want this to devolve into a set of checklists. We were in an era of checklists where people had very, very small skills that you saw, you checked were present or not. So part of it is you want to preserve the integrity of the practice. But you have to decompose it a little bit, right? So in Plato, there are two components to facilitating classroom discourse. The first is simply creating opportunities for student talk. One of the things that's been most discouraging about all the observations we've been doing in classrooms, and I see people nodding their head, is how little students talk. We cheer when we can get to a 2 or a 3 on this because there's so many episodes where kids are basically quiet. Which is level 1. At level 2, you have the most common form of discourse, which is really the IRE. The teacher asks a question, students respond, and the teacher evaluates and move on. At the level 4, you have really elaborated conversation. So the first is, are you creating those opportunities? Are kids talking? The second column is the uptake of student responses. So once you've got kids talking, what do you do with the talk? What do you do with the ideas? And this uptake, we're going to talk more about this, uptake is picking up student ideas, and either students or teachers can do this, and asking for elaboration, justification, coordinating different ideas, helping people develop an argument that's nascent in that idea. All of that is involved with uptake. So we've used this observation protocol now in a number of studies, and I'm not going to go into the details of those, but you can ask me later if you'd like. So we did our own first study with a very small set of teachers in New York, just trying to sort of see if we could see differences between teachers who were in the higher value-added quartile and the lower value-added quartile in the same school. We then expanded that work to close to 200 teachers, and then we've been involved in the MET project as well with a much larger sample of teachers. Part of what motivated me, though, in being involved in the MET was really less about measurement and more about improvement. Because again, part of what you get from using these kinds of observation protocols is a snapshot of instruction across teachers, across schools, across districts. And that snapshot becomes diagnostic. It helps you understand Again, just as Emily was doing with her class, what people are good at and what's the next step. Where do you target resources for this? So I think you can use these snapshots to identify practices to focus on in professional development. And one of the things about the development of all of these protocols is along with the protocols came a whole array of tools, videos that were the representation of those practices, representations at different quality levels in different contexts, right? So there is a whole set of tools that again, we could leverage for professional development that are going to reside within the teacher evaluation space. So how do we bridge those spaces? So here's a snapshot that actually came from a study of about 200 teachers in New York on the Plato elements. And what jumps out at me is that these were middle school classrooms in New York. But look at the classroom environment score. These are really pretty well-managed classrooms. Classroom management is not the problem, right? Look at the average score. That's the highest score on these. But when you look at the quality of instructional scaffolding students are getting, the modeling, the strategy instruction, the accommodations for language learners, much lower, okay? Purpose is high. New York had implemented the Blackboard configuration where you write your aims on the Blackboard. So in every classroom there was a purpose, there was an aim, that they managed to get there through some PD. Classroom discourse is, in the 2.6 range, which is actually not bad compared to what you'll see. So these kinds of snapshots then allow people within a school, within a district, to say, okay, where should we focus attention? So I'm now going to move into the design of professional development around some of these practices. As I said before, part of what people need are the opportunities to see high quality practice. Okay, people see the chopping the onion example? You can go on the web and you can learn an awful lot about cooking. So you can learn how to beat egg whites. I, who've been cooking for many years and have made many souffle, learned actually something from watching this video about the kind of containers you should be using and why. And you can learn how to incorporate those kinds of techniques, lots and lots of representations of practice. And in those representations, they actually decompose the practice. So this video clip on egg whites, which I won't show you, actually really breaks it down into what temperature should the egg whites be, what kind of bowl should they be in, how do you start whipping them, when do you go faster, lots and lots of detail around that practice. But again, you need the opportunities to try it out. So people should probably, if you can see this lower one, it's from the movie Julia and Julie. People saw that movie? Do you remember when Julia Child goes home? And she decides everybody else is better at chopping an onion than she is. Remember, she identifies it as one of those fundamentals. So she goes home and she chops a mountain of onions. That's what the work on expertise calls deliberate practice. She's not trying to cook a whole meal. She's not trying to do anything with those onions. She's isolated one particular core fundamental and practices it over and over again. Teachers, I would argue, have very little opportunity for that kind of deliberate practice. We ask them to try out new and complex things in front of an audience of students. And having been a teacher for many years, I don't think there's any higher risk audience than a group of high school students. So part of this is how do we begin to build both these kinds of opportunities for deliberate practice and settings in which people can do that in a safe space. So the work that we're doing now with Plato, funded by IES, is to think about how do we use the instrument diagnostically and for professional development purposes. So we've begun to do this work with a group of middle school ELA teachers, the same group that was used initially for this, not the same teachers, but the same target population that the protocol was developed around, to target practice for improvement, to begin that work of decomposition around those elements, and then provide opportunities for feedback and practice and feedback. So we focused on those middle school ELA teachers. We deliberately recruited multiple teachers from a department. Again, part of our principle is that these practices are going to spread when people share a common vocabulary and some common experiences around trying these out. At this point now, in the second year, we have virtually the whole department of several schools who are working on this with us. We also then conducted baseline observations to see where people started. So here are their scores on intellectual challenge, feedback, and classroom discourse. So you can see on classroom discourse, kids are barely talking, 1.5. That's lower than the New York data that we had seen. And not much strategy use instruction. Now again, in Plato, if it doesn't exist, it gets a 1. So in many segments, you might not see it, but this was over, I think, a series of 4 lessons. We saw no modeling virtually going on, or very little modeling and almost no strategy instruction. So what we've then tried to do is to organize the professional development around these core practices, going through cycles that basically use the observation. So we've observed the teachers, using the observation diagnostically, and then what we did is basically train the teachers in Plato. So we actually ran a training that's very similar to what we do for raters, for them to understand what these elements are. As part of that, they got to see all the video clips that we use in training raters. And then, and after every element, we had people reflect on where they thought their own practice was with respect to those particular elements. So by the end of the day, we actually shared their scores with them. We didn't share them individually, we shared them collectively. This was the first time that we'd actually shared the scores directly with teachers, so we took a big collective breath. Shared their scores and asked the teachers to choose 2 elements that they wanted to focus on for the rest of the professional development. So again, I think what's important is that teachers as professionals have the opportunity to identify what are the elements that they see a need to develop so that they have a voice in that professional development. The teachers in our study actually chose the 2 elements that they scored lowest in, strategy instruction and classroom discourse. Those are actually both in the individual studies of Plato, ones that are more associated with student achievement as well. So we were all happy about their choice. And we've then begun to weave then targeted professional development around those practices. So what does it look like? It's learning a common language, learning the language of Plato, learning how to use that, and again, this would be true for any observation framework. Seeing lots of examples of practice, the representation. So we have a lot of video clips we've used around classroom discourse and strategy instruction. The work of unpacking the practice and seeing the different components. Opportunities to try out these practices in the professional development first with their colleagues, and then to try them out in their own classrooms. So I'm going to walk you through just quickly some of this work of decomposition, because I was asked about how, in fact, do you teach classroom discourse? How do you help people get better in this? One of the reasons it's been a really useful practice to target is because there it sits, right in the middle of the Common Core. And if you look at the Common Core in ELA, pose questions that connect the ideas of several speakers and respond to others' questions and comments with relevant evidence, observations, and ideas. That's uptake. So the very element that's in Plato is more or less called out in Common Core, and we're working in a district that's trying to implement Common Core in ELA. So this has turned out to be a really great synergy for us. I won't show you this video now, but we have a video clip that actually shows a number of the different components that we focused on with teachers. One of the issues in any kind of professional development is teachers enter at different stages. Some teachers already have kids talking, but the talk doesn't go anywhere, whereas other classrooms, kids aren't talking at all. So part of what we try to do is to identify a number of different components that different groups of teachers are going to tackle and work on. A sample agenda is, again, sort of thinking about, this is for next steps in classroom discourse. So this was about the third or fourth PD around discourse. We began to zoom in on uptake and began to identify, now this is further decomposition, the specific uptake moves that teachers can use to get students to elaborate. The kind of revoicing you need to do to incorporate academic language into students' talk, and the kind of connecting work that teachers are always doing, of connecting different student ideas to move the conversation forward. And again, part of what we did was provide language, right? Provide a language to talk about these moves, watch videos of these different moves, and then we actually had teachers try out these new moves in small group discussions, almost like literature circles, using a literary text. So we give them definitions of uptake. We have, again, further definitions of each of these moves that also turn into tools for both teachers and students. So along with those definitions, then we have, what does it sound like? Right? Because partly, if you're going to try these things out, you need a sense of what does it sound like? What does it look like? These sentence frames also become prompts for students when you're teaching students these same moves. And then for each of these moves, we have targeted videos that show them what does that press move look like? And we generally show multiple examples of what press does and how it functions. Okay, here we were particularly focusing on how do you press for textual evidence? How do you, and that relates to our other element about text-based instruction. How do you get kids to make those connections to text? So we've been working with this first group of teachers now for about a year and a half. No, actually, we started, it's just, I keep forgetting, it's only February. We've been working with them for about a year and a month or so. And we've begun, we continue to observe them and collect observations on them. And this is between January and April. Okay, so just between January and April of last year. And what you'll begin to see is that these are for classroom discourse, that we're beginning to see movement. It's still low, it's still only 1.76, but we're beginning to see more classroom talk. One of the things that's been particularly exciting for the teachers is that once they've gotten the students talking, they're very excited. So they're actually been very, very motivated to work on this because they get immediate feedback from their students. And one teacher who's been teaching for 25 years, who's really a very, very good teacher in many respects, came to us and said, I never knew kids had so many ideas. She said, I never realized they could talk about anything. And she's become now our poster child. She's just like, because she's such a good teacher, she's been able to take what we've done and just ratchet it way up. Unfortunately, she won't let us videotape her. Very upset about this. Strategy instruction, which has been a harder, something that's been a little more challenging to work on, is again going up. We're seeing a little bit more of it. But we really dug it into it this summer. These are all scores from year one. So we're hoping we're going to see more movement in year two. What's interesting, though, is look at the changes in intellectual challenge, which we didn't even discuss, really. We've got the biggest bump in intellectual challenge, and we think part of that is all of the work we're doing in classroom discourse is heightening the cognitive demand for students. The students are doing more of the intellectual work in those classrooms. So we're getting, and actually they're part of the same factor of the cognitive demand. So we're seeing a jump in those as well. And we've seen a jump in overall Plato scores by targeting only 2 of the elements. So again, part of what we're trying to understand is providing professional development on all of these elements is unlikely to make a difference, right? It's too little, right, of any one of these to really be able to move practice. But by drilling in and focusing in on a couple of these, we seem to be improving other elements as well. So again, that's partly the leveraging piece of this. So what are next steps? We started with 1 cohort. We've added a second cohort now. We have about 28 teachers in the second year. We're providing a second year of PD, but we have three three cohorts of teachers. The teachers who've been with us from the very beginning, who are more or less volunteered for this, who really didn't know what they were signing up for. They were able to help us recruit a lot more teachers because they liked it. And so we have another group that joined us before the summer PD, so they got an intensive 4 days and then the rest of the year 1. And then we have a group that joined us after the intensive summer PD. So we're going to be interested to see, again, how time matters and duration and intensity of the professional development experience in terms of moving teachers' practice. If that third cohort can make as much progress as cohort 1, good news for time. We'll see if they can. And we're also using 2 different measures of student learning. So we're using both the district test on ELA, the standardized test, but we also are giving a writing assessment because number of these elements that we're working on we think would show up not on a standardized test that uses multiple choice, but on writing samples. Part of what we're trying to get teachers to learn to do is how do you develop students' arguments through talk? How do you get them to then transfer that talk into writing? So we're hoping that having a second assessment will help us see the effect of some of this. So what have we learned? One, we've learned that grain size matters. Again, you saw how much we decomposed classroom discourse in order to really do that kind of targeted professional development. Tackling something as big as classroom management is too big, right? Some things just starting at press, divorced from everything else, would be too small. So how do you identify the right size for the practice and then for the professional development? We suspect that the grain size for observation can be much larger than the grain size for improvement. That once you get down to that improvement level, it's got to be a smaller grain size. But that's a conjecture. The other thing is that this would be much easier work if there were, in fact, a common curriculum. At middle school ELA doesn't seem to have much of a common curriculum anywhere we've observed. And so we're constantly trying to make sure that the practices are wrapped around content that the teachers can actually teach as a part of their curriculum. So in some ways, the Common Core is going to make this work easier in the sense that you can locate it within something that is more common than what exists now, where teachers are sort of all over the map in terms of the curriculum. We've also learned something about the interdependencies of these core practices. So you saw one side of it when you saw the jump in intellectual challenge that accompanied a more modest rise in classroom discourse. The other way we've seen this is that because our observation protocol only looks at things you can see in the classroom, we don't have planning as one of our fundamental practices. And yet, if you asked me what's absolutely fundamental to good teaching practice, I would, and what I spend a lot of time teaching in pre-service teacher education, planning would be right there. Because we were working with experienced teachers, we didn't think we had to address planning, right? Planning is set. We've got that back in teacher education, right? We can just move on. Well, not really. So we realized that we actually couldn't make, because part of the professional development is planning to use these things in practice, and we had people doing a lot of planning, we suddenly realized that people actually needed more skill around both lesson planning and unit planning. So we've had to go back and reteach planning, which again talks about the importance of mastering those fundamentals early on. And finally, we're discovering something about the differential difficulty of changing practices in these different areas. Classroom discourse, in some ways, is an easy sell. Teachers get so excited when they see the videos of classrooms where kids are actually talking. They are very motivated to try to replicate that in their own classrooms. The challenge is that classroom discourse is a habituated behavior. It's hard to change. And even teachers who are very motivated find it hard to sustain that change. So part of the work, we're seeing changes there, One thing teachers are beginning to do is to use those prompts that we put up in their classrooms for themselves, not for students. They say, it reminds me to press. It reminds me to ask for a follow-up. It reminds me to do all these things. I hope it reminds the students, but it certainly reminds me. So again, thinking about the kinds of resources you can provide for people to maintain some of those changes. Strategy instruction turns out to be a harder sell because it entails subject matter knowledge, because it entails understanding the strategies that skilled readers and writers use. So we've done much more unpacking of what I would call content knowledge for teaching in helping people identify what are strategies for teaching irony, for example, in complex text. Well, you've got to understand irony. You've got to understand how people actually detect irony. And then you've got to think about how you can teach strategies for that detection. So we, as I said, we felt like we really made a breakthrough this summer, so we're eager to see whether or not that actually turned out to be true. So this has been very satisfying work. I started this project back in 2006, I think. 2006, 2000. I wrote the proposal in 2006. We started doing it in 2007. I got distracted by measurement issues with a lot of help from colleagues. We spent a lot of time actually sort of beginning to validate the protocol and understand the protocol. All along, my eye has been on improvement. And so it feels very satisfying to finally be able to leverage this for the improvement of teaching. So let me stop there.
Okay, so we can take some questions, and so why don't we give a question, I'll revoice it, and then Pam can answer the question.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about what you went through in terms of training your supervisors or your observers, so that you got some kind of inter-rater reliability and validity of responses?
Okay, so the question is around training people who observe the practices and make reliable judgments.
So we've now had a lot of experience in the training because of the MET project. In this particular project, I'm relatively blessed. Actually, I'm very blessed because I'm working with Stanford graduate students as the observers. Many of them are doctoral students. Some of them are people who actually helped develop the instrument, but most are not. So when we train raters, when we select raters, we require a background in English language arts and in teaching. So all of our raters have some classroom experience and a background in English. We have a training that Drew has seen, actually many people in this room have seen, where we are basically teaching them each of those elements. And we have descriptions and video representation of what the practice looks like at each of those levels. So like other training, we basically sort of walk them through what's the difference between a 1 and a 2, what's a borderline case, and where does it fall and why, what's the difference between a 2 and a 3. So we have about a 2-day training. Most people actually don't become reliable after those 2 days. But we use those scores, a few do, but most don't. So we follow up with them, they're very close generally, and we then individually can figure out where are they having trouble. Like what are they not getting about each of these elements, and we provide sort of targeted follow-up, and then they retake the certification. So everybody has to pass certification in order to do the observations. So it's an interesting, when we've trained raters, when we were doing this work in New York, we trained a whole set of raters who were not related to the project at all. Many of them had been English teachers. The only people we've not been able to get reliable was one PhD anthropologist who had never taught English, didn't help, a videographer who never taught English, had been in a lot of classrooms, but we feel like that background actually does matter.
I'm curious about the professional development. You mentioned 4 days of summer.
Yeah.
What was the duration and timing of the professional development during the year, and how did you decide on that? And who was delivering, who was facilitating the professional development?
Okay, so the question is about the nature of the professional development, the timing of the professional development during the year, how often we meet, duration, and who facilitates. We have a team that facilitates the professional development. I'm part of that team, so it's some of my doctoral students, a project manager, and myself are the people who conduct the professional development. We meet roughly, so this year we're going to meet 5 days during the school year. So, and that's a full day, and so the grant pays for substitutes. And we run from roughly 9 to 3. The agenda you saw was actually a real agenda from one of our professional developments. We spend the morning until about 1 really digging into the practice and really trying to, and then providing these kind of approximations, opportunities for deliberate practice. The last part of the day is people planning a lesson that uses what they've just learned, that they're going to try out. In addition to those 5 days of professional development, we have roughly 4 school site meetings where we meet them in between professional development sessions at the site, and we run a collegial consultation. People bring artifacts from what they've actually tried from the lesson and share that with each other. So again, we want to keep sort of the press on. And you know, one of the things that's been interesting is, first of all, this district hadn't had professional development in ELA for the last 3 or 4 years. There had been no professional development aimed at English teachers. So, you know, teachers are very receptive because they haven't had anything that focused in on the teaching of reading and writing. The school site meetings have created a new kind of professional community within those schools, right? Because now you have a group of teachers who's spending quite a bit of time together, both at our day-long professional developments, but also at these school site meetings. And it's created a conversation about practice that I think was missing, that becomes then a resource for the district, I think.
Perhaps I'm making an enormous leap here and asking you for too much, but as you know, in New York City, the city just forfeited an enormous amount of money because the union and the mayor could not agree on an assessment of teachers. And it seems to me that you have a beautiful plan here that teachers should actually welcome because it is tied particularly to professional development.
Right.
Is there any possibility that this could have an influence on that kind of discussion that's going on politically in a place like New York City?
I certainly would hope so. And again, I think that I've begun to see the conversation shift a little bit to being just about evaluation and more about getting feedback for teachers. I think that actually seeing, so the teachers in this project, while they were initially very skeptical about Plato, skeptical about being observed, were in their classrooms a fair bit, you know, collecting the observational data, have, because of the value of the professional development, completely bought into the system. Part of it is that it makes sense to them. There is nothing on that protocol that somebody who was an English teacher would probably argue with, right? In many of these protocols, the practices are things that teachers recognize, but they also see that how we're using it is really around their own growth as teachers. So I would hope that that's where the conversation is moving. I know that a number of developers are developing professional development tools to accompany their protocols, and that's where I think we're going to see, if evaluation is going to make a difference, it's going to make a difference in that middle. You know, the bottom will identify a few teachers who are weak, but what you see from looking at these snapshots of instruction is what you really want to be able to do is to bring up overall those scores. And I think investing in this kind of professional development is much more likely to have that kind of effect.
I noticed they were, you know, we heard children, but we didn't see any. Is that a permission thing? Or do you have video with children in it? Because I find the both seeing the teacher explicitly and reactions of the children are extremely valuable.
The question was about the video where you could only see the teacher and not see the students. I think that was, actually we do have the permissions because in other parts of the clip you do see the students. It was more just that particular clip. I agree, the quality of videography and the potential for really having high-quality representations of practice has really changed and developed over the past few years, which the initial videos we collected as part of the Met, we probably could not have used for professional development, even if you had the permissions, because they weren't sharp enough. They weren't, you couldn't hear the kids. You really, for classroom discourse, you really need to hear the kids. So yes, the quality, again, of the technology, I think, is there.
Pam, thank you for your presentation and for also emphasizing using a protocol like this for professional development. It is very welcome to hear that. But my question is, going back to my colleague's first question to you, if I heard correctly, did you say that the background of those applying the protocol with respect to the subject matter is critical, that they were in fact English language arts in their perspective, in their training? And then what does that say about moving forward with teacher evaluations and those that are doing the evaluations perhaps without the sort of the subject matter or the background that you just spoke to? Can you address that?
So, this is a topic about which people disagree. Heather Hill, who did the Mathematical Quality of Instruction instrument, and I both agree on this particular point that we want our raters to have subject matter knowledge. It's hard to identify a strategy for reading and writing if you actually don't know reading and writing, So that's one of the problems we have training people who don't know the content is they miss it. It's there, they miss it. When the quality of modeling of the metacognitive thinking or whatever, people have to know something about that in order to score it. Again, it depends on the practice you're looking for. For classroom management, you probably don't need to have that subject matter background, right? And those are the elements that it's easiest for us to train raters on. Because they can see the behavior, they don't necessarily need to know the subject to do that. Some of it also probably depends, again, on the use of the protocol. So to get a broad brush, I actually think representation of content, to digress, is another one. It's pretty hard to get accurate ratings on that, I think, if you don't actually know the content. And I'm not quite sure how a rater could observe both kindergarten and AP physics and be able to really understand the ways in which teachers are representing content. I know I couldn't. It really does hinge on what is the content. What are the things the teacher's trying to do in kindergarten, and how is that teacher? That takes a different kind of expertise. Again, if you're making broad brush distinctions where you're just trying to see which classrooms are really in trouble, you could probably see a lot of that with a broad brush and maybe without some of that content expertise. Some of the things that we're looking at, we think you do need to have that.
A comment than a question. I really appreciated your presentation as well. And it strikes me that in transferring this to practice in a typical school district that may or may not have a lot of resources behind this, that there are different skill sets perhaps for being good at using the observation tool versus really working with teachers to develop their skills to improve on the observation tool.
Yes.
So I just wondered if you had any suggestions for resources or the kinds of things that would be needed in districts to really move teachers along a professional development continuum.
That's an excellent point. So the comment was that you might need a differentiated expertise around using the observations for evaluation, that the kind of work that might be done around professional development. And how do you think about this in districts? And the district we're working on is similar. It doesn't have a lot of resources. How do you think about that? Part of it, I think, has to do with targeting existing resources that are already in districts and helping them understand these observation tools and how to do professional development around them. So in elementary schools, many elementary schools have access to literacy and math coaches who are logical candidates to do some of this work with teachers around math and ELA. At the secondary level, you have department chairs who used to play a role as an instructional leader. Now, not so much, in part because departments got a bad name somewhere along the way. But they, again, are people who often have expertise in the subject who could be prepared to be professional developers and coaches. So they're another resource that's already there. Teachers with national board certification are another group of people who have expertise in this subject, who probably then need to learn how to become professional developers. And one way to do that is to participate along with people who have those skills and to learn. So I think there are existing resources that districts could draw upon. The other thing I think we have to think about, and this is one of the next steps for Plato, is developing online tools that districts can use, so that a lot of the work we do face-to-face with teachers could be done in an online setting, or where the professional developers might know how to facilitate these kinds of discussions about teaching, but don't necessarily have the time or the skill to choose all of these representations in the descriptions. So you could also, and there are developers who are doing that.
Okay, so please join us for reception outside, and please join me in thanking Pam for a wonderful presentation.